Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching and thank you for reading my book, Golden Years: How Americans Invented and Reinvented Old Age. My name is James Chappel. I'm a associate professor of history at Duke, and I'm here just to talk to you all for a minute about what this book is and why I wrote it and what I hope you get out of it. And I hope you have fun reading it. I tried, I'm a historian. I'm used to writing, long, boring things. I tried my best to write a kind of lively account because it is quite an interesting story. So I'll first say, why would a young man, relatively young man like myself, write a book about aging? Um, as with any sort of academic project, I think there's both intellectual or professional reasons, but also very personal ones. Um, as a professional historian, I look around and I think, well, the biggest difference between the present and the past, even 100 years ago, is that everyone is so much older. This is a massive historical change. I think it impacts everything about contemporary life. I think climate change, racial inequality, all of these things that we're used to thinking about are impacted by our new age pyramid, by the fact that the average age is so much older than it was 100 years ago. I think that we as scholars or as citizens don't think about this nearly enough. And there's almost nothing written on the history of aging, especially in the past 100 years. So I just saw a big gap in not just in the literature, but in kind of American citizens' understanding of what it is to age and how aging has been managed in American life and the history of the policies around aging and ideas around aging and things like that. So I wanted to provide a story for everybody who's getting old. What is everybody? I think that human beings like stories about ourselves and our lives. And so I wanted to provide one for those thinking about aging. And obviously, although I do perhaps seem so young, I'm in fact not that young. I probably look exactly 42, which I am. I turned 40 while I was writing this book. And my parents are now in their 70s. And like so many millions of Americans, and probably like you, having to think about aging, about who's going to care for my parents. What kind of should I have long-term care insurance? Um, should I move back home? Should my parents move here? So many families are in this situation. And, as a historian, I wanted to think about the history of that situation and couldn't find anything. So that's what this book is trying to provide. So that's just the background. I'll say a little bit about what I actually want you to take away from the book. And I'll say two main things about that. The first is just that age has a history. I think that we're used to thinking that, governments have a history and, a car has a history, everything has a history. But our own lives, and especially our own aging, it feels so personal. It feels like something I'm doing myself. And I'll work it out with myself and my kids and my parents and my friends, but it has nothing to do with history. And that's not true. Everything about aging, Social Security, Medicare, senior centers, senior citizens discounts, the idea of retirement, all of this stuff has a pretty recent history and could, in fact, change again pretty quickly. So I think it's important we understand that. Um, and that gets a bit to the main arc of the book. I mean, the book has many different themes. I talk a lot about race and gender and disability and nursing homes and all kinds of things. But if the book has one arc, it's that 100 years ago, nobody cared about aging. It was not seen as a national problem. It was not seen as a issue for policy. It was not seen as an issue for firms to deal with because people weren't that old. And then between the 30s and the 70s, aging became a national project. This is when Social Security and Medicare were passed, but all kinds of other policies and institutions were created. All of these county level welfare agencies that do so much to structure the lives of older people today. Because there was an idea that aging happened for social reasons because of improvements in public health. That's why we've got so many old people. And so old age ought to be a public good. A leisurely, dignified retirement came to seem like your patrimony as an American citizen. And I think that is a beautiful ideal. And I think that in the last 40 years, we've kind of lost that. Um, we have adopted far more individualized and entrepreneurial ideas of aging. which has some good elements to be sure, but also lots of very negative ones because people feel like they're on their own. In a lot of ways, they are on their own. The idea that when you age, it's up to your kids or your family to take care of you, that was a policy decision we made to say this is not a public problem, this is a private problem. And so there's been a privatization of aging and retirement in the last 2 decades. You can also see it in like the rise of the 401k and things like that. All these things I talk about in my book. And so if there's one lesson I want people to take from the book, it's that aging used to be a public good in this country, and I think it ought to be and could be again. So that is that. That's the golden years. Thank you so much for reading it. I'm glad that people are spending their summers, enriching their minds. And thank you again for choosing this book for your summer program. Bye.